3,000 years ago, the Greeks carved a long oval into the valley at Olympia and called it a stadion, from the word for standing place. By 80 AD, the Romans had made it permanent and monumental. The Colosseum held 80,000 people, a roar engineered to project imperial power from every arch and tier. Then the arenas went quiet. For 1,000 years, the spectacle moved to jousting fields and town squares, never gone, just homeless. In 1896, the Greeks rebuilt their ancient stadium in marble for the first modern Olympics, a direct line across 2,600 years of human architecture. Today's arenas hold 100,000 live and hundreds of millions on screens. The oval footprint hasn't changed. The roar hasn't changed. Only the materials did. The stadium is the one structure every civilization has rebuilt from scratch, which is another way of saying the need to witness human competition together is not a habit. It's closer to a law.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll continue talking about the highlights of the FIFA World Cup tournament as the finals approach. For all you history buffs out there, we will include an extensive discussion on the history of FIFA as we unravel the human experience behind sports. I think that most of you will find that part of our segment today perhaps very interesting. This is not just another video about FIFA World Cup highlights and Cristiano Ronaldo's performance. My objective is to give you a bigger picture of the sportsmanship of the FIFA World Cup, and I'm so excited to bring you that today. Thank you all for joining me, and if you would be so kind as to share this video and give it a thumbs up, that would be awesome. There's just a couple of things that I can say about sports with love, and that is it's a beautiful game and it's the dark machine. Now, before we get into the history of FIFA, let's go over some highlights of the tournament that just took place in Texas. I don't know about you guys, but I was on the edge of my seat as the tournament opened in Texas, and I watched as Cristiano Ronaldo faced early challenges, struggling to find rhythm in Portugal's first match against DR Congo. The defensive pressure was tight, the passing lanes were narrow, and Ronaldo spent much of the game searching for space that simply wasn't there. Yet even in that difficult start, his composure and leadership set the tone for what was to come. A few days later in Houston, everything changed. Ronaldo delivered a masterful performance against Uzbekistan, striking twice with clinical precision and becoming the first player in history to score in 6 different World Cups. His opening goal arrived early, a sharp finish that electrified NRG Stadium, followed by a second that showcased his trademark timing and instinct. Portugal's 5-0 victory became one of the most dominant displays of the tournament, and Ronaldo's resurgence reminded the world why his legacy continues to expand. The momentum carried into Portugal's dramatic showdown with Croatia. In a tense physical match, Ronaldo stepped up once again, this time from the penalty spot, becoming the oldest player ever to score in a World Cup knockout round. His equalizer shifted the entire energy of the game, igniting Portugal's comeback and pushing them into the next stage. After the final whistle, Ronaldo's emotional tribute to the late Diogo Jota added a heartfelt moment to the night, showing the human side of a player often defined by records and achievements. From a difficult beginning to a historic resurgence, Ronaldo's journey through the Texas leg of the World Cup has unfolded like a living chapter of football history, a story of endurance, reinvention, and the relentless pursuit of greatness. To understand the emotional depth of the World Cup, it helps to look at the players whose lives are shaped by it. Lionel Messi grew up watching football as escape and dream, carrying the weight of national expectation. Cristiano Ronaldo trained obsessively from a young age, driven by perhaps trauma and for sure ambition. Kylian Mbappe became a symbol for marginalized youth carrying pride and pressure. Neymar's street football roots shaped his creativity and volatility. Their preparation rituals, strict diets, mental conditioning, visualization reflect psychological commitment to childhood dreams. Many recall specific World Cup moments that changed them. Iconic goals, heartbreaking losses, or the roar of a stadium. These memories form a collective emotional archive shared by fans worldwide. Even as FIFA's history is marked by controversy, player stories remind us of the heart of the sport, lives, and human experience. Their journeys show how football transforms trauma into purpose. And in the end, it is these stories that keep fans believing in the beauty of the game. As we reach the end of this journey, we're reminded that sports are far more than games. They are mirrors of power, culture, and the human spirit. The stories we've explored reveal how athletes carry the weight of expectation, how nations use competition to shape identity, and how fans turn moments on the field into memories that last a lifetime. Behind every victory and every controversy lies a deeper truth about who we are, what we value, and how the world continues to change around us. This documentary invites you to look beyond the scoreboard and see the people, the politics, and the emotions that define the global language of sport, a language that continues to evolve, inspire, and connect us all.
Football, a sport between politics and passion, weaponized by institutions, yet resilient in the human spirit.
In 1930, Uruguay declared a national holiday to celebrate winning the first World Cup. It was a victory that proved football could embed itself into the core of a national identity, giving a small nation a way to assert itself on a stage usually reserved for global superpowers. This massive emotional weight was exactly what FIFA's founders failed to anticipate. When 7 European nations met in 1904 to form the organization, they were there as technicians. Their goal was simple: standardize the rules and regulate cross-border play. Viewing themselves as administrators, early leaders built an organization focused on logistics, ignoring the game's influence. This created a vacuum. The fans' intense psychological investment became a raw resource of public energy, left vulnerable and open to any regime willing to provide its own direction. This turned the pitch into a tool for sovereign legitimacy. Governments realized the game could shape how the world perceived their power. As technology bridged the gap between continents, the tournament's massive global visibility turned it into a target for regimes seeking to project an image of strength and discipline to a captive audience. Benito Mussolini was the first to master this. During the 1934 World Cup, the Italian regime treated the matches as a propaganda tool, using the tournament to project fascist discipline to the rest of the world. The regime turned the athletes into symbols of the state. By 1938, the Italian team was playing in the black shirts of Mussolini's paramilitary forces, while the regime pressured referees and officials to ensure the results matched the national narrative. FIFA watched this happen and maintained its stance of neutrality. The organization's leadership prioritized the continuity of the matches over the political context of the host, a choice that allowed authoritarian regimes to use the World Cup as a shield for their ideologies. Mussolini proved that the pitch could project strength. His success created a blueprint for how a sporting event could provide a regime with international recognition and a sense of national destiny. In 1978, the military junta in Argentina used that same blueprint to hide a much darker reality. They leveraged a home turf victory to present Argentina as a stable and modern nation to the international press. While the world watched the score, the reality was unfolding just beyond the stadium walls. A brutal regime was operating clandestine detention centers where thousands of citizens were tortured or disappeared, often just miles away from the cheering crowds. This created a surreal split. The tournament wasn't just reflecting the nation's pride, it was being used to mask state violence, using the roar of the fans to drown out the screams of the disappeared. The 1978 World Cup demonstrated that the spectacle could distract from systemic terror, providing a veneer of international celebration while a dictatorship silenced its own people. By the late 20th century, the spectacle had grown into a global business empire. Under leaders like Sepp Blatter, FIFA turned the World Cup into a hyper-lucrative vehicle for branding, making the rights to host the tournament more valuable than ever. The 2015 Zurich arrests revealed the cost of that growth. Indictments for bribery and racketeering showed that hosting rights and marketing deals were frequently tied to internal patronage, turning the selection of host nations into a process of financial exchange. This commercial drive led the tournament to Qatar, where the human cost became impossible to ignore. Migrant workers faced dangerous conditions and unpaid wages to build the stadiums required for a month-long festival of luxury. When African nations collectively boycotted the 1966 World Cup to protest their lack of representation, they proved that this visibility could also be used to challenge power. By refusing to play, they forced FIFA to change its qualification structure and eventually expel apartheid South Africa. The history of the World Cup is a constant struggle between those who want to use the game to project authority and those who use it to demand recognition. Fans live with this tension. We enjoy the matches while knowing the pitch is surrounded by stories of institutional corruption and political maneuvering. After a century of being used as a tool for propaganda and profit, why does the game still hold such a deep emotional pull for billions of people? The answer is in the players. Athletes like Lionel Messi carry the weight of national expectation every time they play, turning the pitch into a space where personal dreams and collective hopes intersect. For players like Kylian Mbappe, the World Cup is a symbol of possibility for kids from marginalized neighborhoods. They use the game to bypass the corrupt structures surrounding them, transforming their own histories into a global standard of excellence. While dictators build the stadiums and executives manage the contracts, they cannot own the experience. The sport survives because it transforms individual hardship into a shared memory that belongs to the fans and the players.
Before we get into the weeds, we have to start by asking ourselves, is football just a game, or is it actually a geopolitical weapon? If you think the stadium is just a place to kick a ball around, well, the sources we're digging into today are going to totally shatter that illusion. As we'll see, for over a century, the pitch has served as a massive global stage for propaganda, resistance, soft power, and some seriously immense commercial influence. Here's our agenda for today. We're going to trace FIFA's 120-year history through 5 distinct acts: the birth of a global spectacle, propaganda and state terror, boycotts and breaking barriers, the empire of corruption, and finally, the soul of the game.
All right, let's jump right into Act 1, the birth of a global spectacle.
It's pretty wild to look at how this organization actually transformed. Back in 1904, FIFA was founded by just 7 European nations. They saw themselves purely as administrators, just standardizing technical rules. But fast forward to the post-1930 era, and the whole shebang shifts. Their primary focus suddenly becomes curating this globally aspirational spectacle, and seemingly overnight, they become the absolute gatekeepers of sovereign legitimacy on the world stage. The real catalyst for this massive shift? The 1930 World Cup in Uruguay. When Uruguay actually won that inaugural tournament, it was such a profound moment for them that their government literally declared a national holiday. For FIFA, this was a light bulb moment. It proved the sport possessed this intense emotional power to shape national identity. It created a massive psychological vacuum, and ambitious political actors quickly realized they could easily exploit this to consolidate state power. Which brings us to Act 2, propaganda and state terror. So, according to our texts, international football is basically a masterclass in soft power. That's the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction, rather than just forcing them. So when a nation wins on the pitch, it isn't just an athletic achievement, right? It's carefully curated as proof of ideological superiority. To pull this off, dictatorships historically rely on a very specific, 3-pillared blueprint. First up is legitimacy. Hosting a massive event gives a regime this implicit international stamp of approval. Second is unity. The high stakes of the game create a temporary sense of national harmony, which is super useful for suppressing any internal dissent. And third, distraction. It totally redirects the entire world's gaze away from internal repression or violence. Let's look at a really glaring historical example of this in action. Benito Mussolini explicitly weaponized the 1934 and 1938 tournaments into pure propaganda theater to project Italian strength and fascist superiority. Match venues were absolutely saturated with fascist iconography. In 1938, the Italian squad literally wore black shirts, which was the specific uniform of Mussolini's paramilitary forces. Plus, the state put intense pressure on referees, creating this suffocating atmosphere. Imagine being a player walking that psychological tightrope. And how did FIFA respond to all this? Well, they just claimed neutrality, prioritizing the logistics of the tournament way over any ethical concerns. This leads us to what the sources call the surreal split during the 1978 Argentina World Cup. The military junta used the tournament entirely for distraction. On the one hand, you had the spectacle, cheering fans, national jubilation, the pristine image of a modern nation. But the reality? Just miles away from those roaring stadiums, a murderous regime was operating clandestine terror centers, actively disappearing its own citizens. And that horrific reality actually bled right onto the pitch. 6-0. That is the score of Argentina's highly suspicious victory over Peru during that 1978 tournament. To this day, that match is completely marred by allegations of backroom political deals and state pressure to secure the exact goal margin Argentina needed to reach the final. Once again, genuine sporting joy was hijacked to legitimize a regime of terror. And FIFA's strict insistence on being apolitical just meant turning a blind eye to the atrocities unfolding right next door.
Moving forward to Act 3, boycotts and breaking barriers.
During the Cold War era, emerging nations in Africa and Asia finally started pushing back against FIFA's Eurocentric bias. In 1966, things really came to a head. African nations launched a massive collective boycott of the World Cup after being offered just one single shared qualifying spot for both Africa and Asia. This was a huge structural turning point. By flat-out refusing to participate, these nations forced FIFA to confront its inequality. It proved that marginalized nations could use the sport for more than just playing. They could use it to protest and exert real, tangible geopolitical power. We saw this collective power in action again with apartheid South Africa. The apartheid regime actually proposed a, frankly, absurd solution to participate. They wanted to send an all-white team to one tournament and an all-black team to another. Just ridiculous, right? Driven heavily by the very real threat of massive boycotts from African and Asian nations that could have totally destabilized the tournaments, FIFA finally dropped its apolitical shield. They suspended and eventually fully expelled the apartheid regime from the organization. It was a rare, powerful moment where global pressure literally forced institutional action against racism.
That brings us to Act 4, the Empire of Corruption.
As the Cold War ended, decades of unchecked greed started catching up with the organization. From the 1980s through the 2000s, FIFA aggressively expanded into a hyper-lucrative global business, essentially normalizing bribery and kickbacks along the way. But it all came crashing down in 2015. Authorities actually raided a luxury hotel in Zurich, arresting top FIFA executives for racketeering. The public trust was completely shattered. But here's the kicker. The deeply controversial bidding process had already awarded the 2018 and 2022 World Cups to Russia and Qatar, decisions that were absolutely plagued by allegations of hidden backroom deals. The sources really highlight the severe human cost of the Qatar spectacle in particular. To build all that shiny new infrastructure, Qatar relied heavily on a massive population of migrant workers. These workers faced incredibly dangerous conditions, heavily restricted rights, and widespread unpaid wages. It exposed a profound, undeniable disconnect between modern FIFA's glossy official human rights policy and the brutal, on-the-ground realities of its hosting decisions. The spectacle was quite literally built on the exploitation of vulnerable people. Finally, let's look at Act 5, the soul of the game. Let's conclude this explainer with a bit of a tonal shift away from all that institutional darkness. Because despite the political maneuvering, the state-sponsored propaganda, and the rampant boardroom corruption we've just talked about, players constantly emphasize this exact sentiment. The beauty of the game belongs to the people. Even right after those 2015 scandals broke, players were speaking out, reminding us all that the true heart of the sport belongs to the fans and the athletes, not to executives in luxury hotels. When you look at the journeys of these iconic players, you see the actual, real power of the pitch. Think about Lionel Messi, starting out in Rosario, Argentina, and eventually carrying the massive, suffocating weight of an entire nation's expectations every single time he puts on the shirt. Or Cristiano Ronaldo, whose obsessive drive and training from a young age was fueled by a burning desire to lift his family out of poverty. Look at Kylian Mbappe, standing as a symbol of possibility and a multicultural future for kids from marginalized neighborhoods. Or Neymar, taking the raw creativity and resilience of Brazilian street football straight to the world stage. These stories prove how the sport takes personal trauma and hardship and transforms it into this universal fuel for excellence.
So the ultimate takeaway from all this source material is that the game survives all of this top-down exploitation for one simple reason. It is firmly anchored in human aspiration. It creates what the texts beautifully call a collective emotional archive. The memories of childhood dreams, of beating the odds, of screaming in a roaring stadium, these shared human experiences easily outlast the propaganda and the institutional power. The soul of the game remains unyielding, kept alive by the players and everyday people.
But as we have seen today, that incredible, raw human emotion is exactly what makes the sport such an incredibly valuable tool for those in power. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought from our texts. Can institutional power ever be truly accountable when the spectacle is just so unimaginably lucrative?
It's definitely something to chew on the next time you hear the roar of a stadium crowd.
Imagine a group of 7 men sitting in this cramped, slightly stuffy room in Paris. The year is 1904.
Right.
And they're arguing over standardizing the rules of the game. Like, they see themselves purely as this administrative committee, essentially a sporting homeowners association trying to decide if the fences should be white or beige.
Yeah, just bureaucrats, really.
Yes, exactly. They have absolutely no idea that they were about to birth this massive geopolitical superpower. So welcome to today's deep dive. It is July 16th, 2026, and we're looking at a stack of incredibly revealing sources today.
You really are.
We've got excerpts from FIFA, The Geopolitical Evolution of Global Football, this sharp analysis titled The Geopolitics and Moral Evolution of FIFA, and the book The Pitch of Power. Our mission today is to figure out how that tiny accidental homeowners association transformed into a global empire. Okay, let's unpack this. Because while billions of you tuning in, you watch for the breathtaking passes and the drama on the grass, the real high-stakes game is actually being played in the boardrooms and the halls of state power.
Yeah, and that is the essential shift in perspective we need to take today. If you want to understand the history of international football, you basically have to stop looking at it merely as a sport.
Right.
We're examining a highly calibrated vehicle for soft power and, well, athletic statecraft. This is a story about how nations shape global perception, how they assert their geopolitical identity, and how they sometimes hide their darkest realities all through the lens of a 90-minute match.
I mean, I am trying to wrap my head around that massive leap, though. You have these 7 European guys in 1904 just trying to format a rule book.
Yeah.
How do you go from measuring pitch dimensions to wielding the kind of global influence that rivals the United Nations? Like, did early FIFA have some sort of master plan for world domination?
Oh, they really didn't. They were purely administrators. But the turning point, the moment the monster was truly born, so to speak, happened in 1930.
Okay, what happened in 1930?
That's when Uruguay hosted the inaugural World Cup. This was when the tournament evolved from just a regional novelty into this massive psychological event, and the impact was staggering.
In what way?
Well, when Uruguay won that first tournament, the victory was so profoundly meaningful to their national psyche that the government actually declared a national holiday.
Wait, a national holiday? Just for winning a soccer tournament?
A full national holiday.
That proves right there that the sport had tapped into something way beyond just, athletic competition. But why Uruguay? Like, why was it so deeply felt by them specifically?
What's fascinating here is the underlying mechanism of what the sources call the emotional vacuum.
The emotional vacuum?
Exactly. You have to look at the geopolitical reality of the early 20th century. Early FIFA, much like the diplomatic world at the time, was heavily Eurocentric.
Right, very colonial.
Yes, its structures completely mirrored colonial hierarchies. So, if you were a smaller or marginalized nation, you were entirely sidelined on the world stage. You didn't have massive militaries or the economic leverage to force the world to look at you.
So the football pitch basically becomes a completely flat playing field.
Exactly that. When the World Cup was created, these marginalized nations saw a rare opportunity. They poured their psychological identity, their desperate desire for international recognition, entirely into this single sport.
Wow.
They created this massive emotional vacuum. It became the one arena where a nation like Uruguay could definitively assert its superiority over a European power. And once that intense psychological investment was established by the public, well, it changed the DNA of the sport forever.
Because that emotional vacuum was so intense, it couldn't remain empty. I mean, if you're listening to this and thinking about how power works, you know that the moment a population becomes universally obsessed with a single event, some savvy politician is going to notice.
Oh, absolutely.
A dictator realizes they don't need to invent a propaganda machine from scratch. They just need to co-opt the one that's already happening on the pitch. Which brings us to the authoritarian blueprint.
Right.
Our sources outline incredibly stark historical facts about how regimes weaponize the mechanics of the tournament. And looking objectively at Mussolini's Italy in the 1930s versus the Argentine military junta in 1978, the contrast in how they use the sport is just chilling.
It really is a study in two completely different strategies of statecraft. You look at Mussolini, and he utilized the 1934 and 1938 World Cups for the blatant projection of strength. He wanted to force the international community to look at a disciplined, revitalized, and heavily militarized Italy.
And the mechanical details of how he did this are wild. It wasn't just about hosting the games. They physically draped the stadiums in fascist iconography.
Giant symbols everywhere.
Yeah. The opening ceremonies were entirely co-opted, featuring speeches that explicitly framed a football victory as a metaphor for national destiny. And it goes further than that, right?
It does.
During the 1938 tournament hosted in France, the Italian state actually forced their team to wear black shirts on the pitch. And that wasn't a stylistic color choice.
No, not at all.
That was the specific, recognizable uniform of Mussolini's paramilitary forces.
Yeah.
Like, they quite literally turned the athletes into visual extensions of fascist ideology for a global audience.
Exactly. Mussolini used the broadcast to say, look at our power. But the military junta in Argentina used the 1978 World Cup for a completely different psychological purpose.
Which was distraction, right?
Distraction, yes. By 1978, the Argentine regime was facing mounting international scrutiny. They desperately needed to present a facade of modern stability and unity to the world, while internally they were engaging in systemic, horrific human rights abuses.
Right.
The sources describe the 1978 tournament as this surreal split.
I want to dig into the logistics of that surreal split, because the way the broadcast actively mapped the reality is terrifying. On television, you have the ultimate spectacle. You see roaring crowds, brand new infrastructure, national jubilation, and Argentina marching toward a victory on their home turf.
A perfect picture.
Right. But the reality hidden just out of the camera's frame was a nightmare. Clandestine torture in detention centers like the infamous ESMA facility were operating literally just miles away from those cheering stadiums.
Just down the street, essentially.
Yeah. The state was actively silencing dissidents and disappearing citizens. And they used the logistical requirements of the World Cup, the clean streets, the heavy security, the controlled media environments, as the exact cover they needed to hide their atrocities from the international press.
It was incredibly calculated.
And there are even lingering historical allegations that Argentina's highly suspicious 6-0 victory over Peru in that tournament was secured through backroom geopolitical deals, like involving grain shipments and political favors.
And this raises the most critical question of the era. Through all of this, Mussolini's black shirts, Argentina's state terror, what was FIFA doing? How did the administrators actually react?
Well, according to the text, they claimed absolute neutrality.
They did. FIFA leadership consistently fell into what the analysis calls the neutrality trap.
The neutrality trap.
Right. Their administrative logic was that, as a sports organization, they were strictly apolitical. But by hiding behind that neutrality, they were making a very deliberate political choice.
Choosing to look the other way.
Exactly. They prioritized the logistics of the tournament, ensuring the matches happened on time, ensuring the stadiums were full over any ethical considerations. They allowed the fascist displays and the masking of state terror to go entirely unchecked because, to the administrators in Zurich, interrupting the spectacle was deemed far more dangerous than ignoring the horrific reality of their host nations.
Okay, I have to challenge that administrative logic, though, because calling that neutrality feels like an absolute cop-out.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, if your global tournament requires a dictator to clear the streets and build a massive, expensive facade, and you then broadcast that facade to billions of people, you aren't neutral. You are an active participant in their public relations strategy. If you build the stage for the propaganda, you are complicit.
From a modern ethical standpoint, you are absolutely right. But let's look at the historical logic those administrators were operating under at the time.
Okay.
Put yourself in the shoes of a FIFA executive in the 1930s or the 1970s. Their singular, overarching mandate was, the ball must roll. To them, acknowledging the political reality meant the tournament would inevitably fracture along geopolitical fault lines.
And the whole thing would fall apart.
Right. Their fragile organization would collapse entirely. So they convinced themselves that by focusing purely on the logistics, the grass, the referees, the schedules, they were somehow absolving themselves of the geopolitical context.
Just focusing on the clipboard.
Yes, that is the essence of the neutrality trap. By desperately trying to protect the physical game, they sacrificed its moral foundation.
They traded complicity for logistics. Wow. But the power dynamic of the World Cup wasn't purely a top-down tool for dictators. This is where the narrative takes a really fascinating turn.
It really does.
Because the sources show that by the 1960s, the marginalized nations, figured out how to use that exact same administrative structure from the bottom up to force massive change.
It is a remarkable pivot in the history of soft power. Historically, regions like Africa and Asia were entirely sidelined by FIFA's Eurocentric voting structure,
Right.
but they eventually realized a fundamental truth about the tournament. A World Cup has no global legitimacy without the rest of the world.
Obviously.
They realized they held massive geopolitical leverage if they coordinated their actions. The prime example the sources provide is the 1966 World Cup boycott.
And the logistics of that boycott are incredible. Like leading up to 1966, FIFA had allocated a grand total of one shared qualifying spot for the entirety of Africa and Asia combined.
Which is insane.
One spot for two massive continents. It was mathematically insulting.
It was a blatant reflection of the old colonial mindset. So, in response to this systemic inequality, African nations did something unprecedented. They collectively boycotted the qualification process.
They just walked away.
They essentially organized a continent-wide strike.
They just refused to play.
Huh.
And the mechanics of this bottom-up resistance get even more intense when you look at the expulsion of apartheid South Africa.
Yes.
The apartheid regime desperately wanted to stay in the international fold, so they proposed a compromise that is, honestly, almost hard to believe. They told FIFA, we will send an all-white team to one World Cup and then an all-black team to the next one.
It was the literal manifestation of institutionalized racism presented as a diplomatic compromise.
It was wide.
And FIFA did eventually suspend and then expel South Africa.
Yeah.
It was a very rare departure from their strict apolitical stance.
Oh, yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture of how power functions, we have to look closely at why FIFA finally acted. It was not a sudden moral awakening in the boardroom.
Of course not.
The decision to expel South Africa was heavily driven by the very real threat of broader, massive boycotts from African and Asian nations.
It is the ultimate global labor strike. Like, think about the mechanics of it. The marginalized nations are the workers. FIFA is the factory management. For decades, management completely ignored the workers because they assumed the workers had no leverage and no alternatives. But the moment the workers unionize, the moment these marginalized nations unite and say, we are the product, and if you don't expel this racist regime, we will walk out and ruin your tournament. Management goes into an absolute panic.
Exactly.
The marginalized nations proved that they held the actual power when they united. Because without them, the tournament loses its global legitimacy. And, far more importantly to the administrators, it loses its revenue.
That financial threat was the true catalyst for change, and that transition is critical to our timeline. Because as these marginalized nations forced their way into the tournament, the global audience for the World Cup exploded.
It became huge.
It went from a popular tournament to a worldwide obsession. But with that massive, diverse global audience came the attention of multinational corporations. Hyper-lucrative television deals and exclusive sponsorships started pouring in.
Right.
And that unprecedented financial explosion led directly to the sport's darkest commercial era.
Yeah, we are entering the greed era, spanning roughly from the 1980s through the 2000s. Under the leadership of Joan Havelange and later Sepp Blatter, FIFA fundamentally morphed.
It completely changed.
It wasn't just a naive administrative body anymore, and it wasn't just a political tool for statecraft. It became a sprawling global business empire. And the sources are incredibly clear on the mechanics of this era. It was rotted from the inside out by systemic corruption.
The commercial reach of the World Cup during this time became unparalleled. But as the billions of dollars flowed in, the culture inside FIFA shifted dramatically. Unquestioning loyalty to the leadership became far more important than institutional transparency.
It was a club.
A very exclusive club. In exchange for awarding highly coveted hosting bids and exclusive marketing rights, a dark normalization occurred within the executive committee. Bribery, massive kickbacks, and internal patronage simply became the accepted cost of doing business.
And it all spectacularly crashed down in 2015. Decades of unchecked, systemic greed ended with Swiss and U.S. authorities coordinating a massive raid.
I remember watching that on the news.
The imagery is cinematic. Law enforcement raiding the luxury Baro Lac Hotel in Zurich, holding up white sheets to hide top FIFA executives as they were arrested and escorted into police cars.
Incredible scene.
The indictments were for wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. It exposed a deep, complex network of systemic corruption that completely shattered whatever public trust the institution had left.
Completely.
But even after the arrest, the structural problems didn't just vanish. I mean, you only have to look at the incredibly opaque, highly lobbied bids that awarded the 2018 World Cup to Russia and the 2022 World Cup to Qatar.
And those specific bids intensified global scrutiny precisely because they highlighted a massive disconnect between FIFA's slick modern public messaging and the actual reality on the ground.
Right.
The Qatar World Cup in particular evolved into a massive moral and logistical scandal. The sheer scale of the infrastructure required to host the spectacle in a desert nation had a severe human cost.
Yeah, a terrible cost.
Qatar had to rely heavily on a massive influx of migrant workers, and human rights organizations documented how these workers faced incredibly dangerous physical conditions, severely restricted legal rights, and chronically unpaid wages just to build the stadiums on time.
See, here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Yeah.
If you look at modern FIFA, they use all this pristine PR-friendly language.
Oh, absolutely.
They formally introduced a human rights policy. They run ad campaigns about inclusion, sustainability, and social responsibility.
Yeah.
But then you look at the actual mechanisms of where they choose to host the games and the brutal reality of the human cost required to build those specific stadiums. The hypocrisy is absolutely glaring.
It is a profound disconnect, and it shows how the nature of the corruption evolved. If you go back to the 1930s, Mussolini was using the game for national destiny propaganda. It was ideological.
Right, about fascism.
Exactly. But by the 21st century, the compromises were driven entirely by modern corporate necessity. The corruption shifted from ideological statecraft to maintaining an immense, highly lucrative spectacle at any cost.
Money over everything.
It became about rewarding internal loyalty and ensuring those multi-billion-dollar broadcast revenue streams continued uninterrupted, completely regardless of the ethical toll on the ground.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? If you were sitting there thinking about all this systemic corruption, the racketeering, the history of state terror, the fascist propaganda, the migrant worker exploitation, the million-dollar question is, why do billions of us still care so much? Like, why don't we just turn off the television?
Because as consumers of the sport, we instinctively separate the corrupt institutional framework from the purity of what actually happens on the pitch.
We split it in our heads.
We do. The heart of the game, the reason it holds that emotional vacuum, isn't found in a luxury hotel boardroom in Zurich. It is found entirely in the lived experiences of the players on the grass.
The sources spend a lot of time analyzing this human element, and it is a vital distinction to make. Let's talk about the players. You look at someone like Lionel Messi.
A perfect example.
When he steps onto the pitch, he isn't just playing a game. He is carrying the literal weight, the expectations, and the complex history of his hometown of Rosario and all of Argentina.
And you contrast that with a player like Cristiano Ronaldo, whose narrative is built on obsessive, relentless training from a very young age, driven by an intense, almost survivalist desire to pull his family out of crushing poverty.
Right. Then you have Kylian Mbappe, who views the World Cup as a symbol of immense possibility. He is visibly carrying the pride of the marginalized banlieues, the neighborhoods of France that are often ignored by the state.
Or Neymar, who channels the raw resilience, the joy, and the deep creativity of Brazilian street football onto the most structured, high-stakes stage in the world.
It's beautiful, really.
It is. For these athletes, football is not about geopolitical soft power. It is a highly personal mechanism to transform personal trauma, poverty, and collective struggle into a display of absolute human excellence.
It makes me think of a metaphor. It is like discovering an absolute masterpiece of a painting, but it happens to be hanging inside a building owned by a notoriously corrupt landlord.
That's a great way to put it.
You don't walk into that building to cheer for the guy in the back office who is making shady deals and exploiting the construction workers. You walk in because when you stand in front of the canvas, the brushstrokes move you to tears.
Exactly.
You recognize the genius and the struggle of the artist. When we watch a World Cup, we aren't cheering for FIFA's administrative body. We are cheering for the human struggle, the preparation, and the breathtaking triumph on the grass.
Exactly. That emotional memory, watching a childhood hero cry after a devastating defeat, or hearing the unified roar of 80,000 people in a stadium that is a collective archive shared by fans globally.
Yeah.
It is the genuine human experience that keeps the sport universally alive, despite the massive geopolitical and corporate machinery constantly trying to control it from the top down.
It has been an incredible journey looking through these sources today. We started this deep dive looking at a tiny Parisian committee of 7 guys in 1904, who just wanted to measure a field.
Hard to believe.
It really is. We watched the mechanics of how that committee accidentally created a massive emotional vacuum, which was then systematically hijacked by fascist propaganda in Italy and state terror in Argentina.
We saw the darkest parts of the 20th century play out on the pitch.
We did. And then we saw how marginalized African and Asian nations realized they could use that exact same broadcast platform as a stage for bottom-up resistance and collective labor power. And finally, we unpacked how it mutated into a deeply flawed, hyper-lucrative corporate empire where the global spectacle comes with a very real, very heavy human cost.
This raises an important question for anyone consuming global sports today. The history we've unpacked shows that critical thinking is absolutely essential when you are engaging with any mass spectacle.
Totally.
The next time you sit down to watch a major global sporting event, you won't just be tracking the ball.
You are now equipped to read the hidden language of the broadcast. You will see the stadium symbolism, the geopolitical posturing, the institutional gatekeeping, and the massive mechanisms of soft power at play behind every single goal. But I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Building on that shift toward the commercial era.
Okay.
We've spent a lot of time talking about how the 20th century was defined by nation-states, governments, and dictators using the World Cup for political propaganda. But what happens now in the 21st century?
That is the big unknown.
We are living in an era where massive tech conglomerates and multinational corporations are rapidly becoming wealthier and more globally powerful than actual sovereign countries. If the emotional vacuum of international football is always looking for a new master to fill it, will the soft power of the game eventually be bought out not by governments, but by corporate states?
It's a real possibility.
Who will really own the pitch of power tomorrow? Will the real high-stakes game leave the halls of state power, only to be permanently locked inside the corporate boardroom?